Can I ask you a question? Are all transgender people and those who advocate for their existence, survival, and success trans rights activists? I'm inclined to say no, that advocating for my existence shouldn't be seen as radical. But it's clear to me that some on the so-called left are only comfortable with transgender people as long as they are in perpetual subjugation to those who are not transgender.
This is not a winning issue for us. It is what it is. You do what you want with that information.
Well, the advocates and activists for the transgender community would respond with, we don't care about the politics, right? We don't care about.
Okay, but then don't come. No, I gotta say.
Let me just finish my thought, Cenk, for 1 second.
Go ahead.
Okay, they'll say that, but okay, you don't care about the politics? Let's just, for once in your life, think strategically about what that means.
You know, I'm gonna be very honest with you. I haven't been a fan of TYT for a very long time. I've been on panels with both Cenk and Ana, and frankly, both of them strike me as, well, liberal blowhards who are far too invested in respectability politics. So much that they often can't see beyond their own ass. Cenk especially. Now, to deep throat them a little bit, I will say that TYT is incredibly impressive in that they started as an independent news source who has grown to be someone that people actually listen to. You guys know that I've been on YouTube for a very long time, so I will definitely say that I've seen them grow, and I think that their success is worth celebration. But what isn't worth celebration is their recent decision to turn in a more reactionary direction and decide that transgender people are not worth advocating for if it means they stand in the way of electing Democratic politicians.
For once in your life, think strategically about what that means. That means that you're gonna continue pushing the Democratic Party to unequivocally support everything that the trans activists want, even if it's unpopular among the electorate. That means they're not getting reelected. That means they're gonna lose to Republicans. Republican lawmakers who are passing draconian, disgusting legislation in various states right now as we speak against the transgender community. So how does that make you win exactly?
No, that is incredibly selfish of activists who are betraying their own community. Because when you say I don't care about elections, who cares about the Democrats? That isn't the point. The Republicans introduced over 600 bills against the LGBTQ community. That's because of elections, and over 70 of them have already passed. When you say I don't care about winning and I don't care about elections, what you're saying is I'm super selfish leftist activist and I'd like to build my cloud. But meanwhile, I'm willing to throw trans people and the entire LGBTQ community under the bus, knowing that these bills are gonna pass because we're laser focused on a losing issue. And by the way, you schmucks, you're falling exactly into the right-wing trap. They lose on everything else. But idiot activists, yes, I just called you an idiot. Activists go in there and go, no, I'm gonna fall right into that trap and I'm gonna fight on the only losing ground we have so we can elect more Republicans so they can pass more anti-LGBT laws. Great, well played. I'm sure your clout and your brand is doing great.
You know, there's actually very few things you can call me that would actually offend me, but a Democrat is pretty high on that list. And situations like this remind me of exactly why I feel that way. Cenk and Ana seem to think that advocacy for transgender people may lead to a loss for Democratic politicians, which effectively communicates that our bodies are just simply, you know, the cost of business for their success. And you know, Democrats make arguments like this pretty frequently, and then they wonder why they don't get votes in certain districts. Did you know that according to Data for Progress, that 75% of LGBT voters believe that the Democratic Party isn't doing enough for the LGBT community? But of course, their votes don't matter, do they? Like many liberals, instead, they focus on finding common ground with bigots in hopes that one day, just one day, they'll vote blue. But do you know what's funny about that? We're seeing more and more that Republicans don't actually care about these anti-LGBT legislations as much as you may think they do.
Republicans doubled down on anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric in the midterms. It wasn't a winning platform. This year saw an underwhelming showing for anti-LGBTQ candidates and historic wins for LGBTQ nominees. So a little more specifics here. And yes, it also addresses the trans sports part as well. So according to exit polling from LGBTQ plus advocacy organization, the Human Rights Campaign, and data analytics firm Catalyst, voters ranked LGBTQ plus issues as low on their list of priorities for 2022. More than half, 52%, chose inflation, and 29% picked abortion. Transgender healthcare and participation in sports came in last on the list of issues, with just 5%. The one data set that we have where it is very clear the focus from the right was on hatred of transgender people, they lost historically.
Ron DeSantis recently put out a very homoerotic ad basically saying that he's more against the LGBT community than Donald Trump. And we're seeing that it's not actually translating into him getting more votes. For most Republicans, this anti-LGBT shit is just not one of their primary concerns, and the polls show this.
I'm wondering if you think that DeSantis's very public war on woke distracts from the message that you like about him.
A little bit, I do.
He did sign a law that restricts transgender care for adults as well as kids.
I have greater concerns about the 6-week abortion ban.
Tell me about that.
I think if he made it clear that he's a states' rights person and that he's not looking to pass a national law in this regard, I would be less concerned.
So that shines a very peculiar light on Ana and Cenk and their particular vitriol against transgender people advocating for themselves. And this is probably my main issue with all of this. Both Cenk and Ana consider themselves to be, in their own ways, supporters of the transgender community. They have, from time to time, stood against transphobic bigotry, and I guess that is progressive in a society that would describe me as a trans rights activist for wanting to use the women's restroom. But see, the problem that I have with this is they're pretending that it's all about electoral politics, but the reality is that's just a shield against the reality that they do indeed engage in transphobia, and that beyond these conversations, they often sound indistinguishable from the right-wing bigots that they are arguing they are not.
One of the issues that you're totally downplaying right now, not even mentioning, is that some school districts want to, let's say a student comes out and identifies as transgender, school districts want to support that student and help him or her through that transition without ever having to notify the parents. I think there are issues there.
Okay,
and I do not begrudge parents for being concerned about that.
Ana, I agree with you.
In this clip, Ana said that she takes issue with a school not communicating to the family of a transgender child that the trans kid is socially transitioning at school. And as somebody who did this in school, I have obviously a lot to say about that. Part of the problem with these conversations is that most of you are not in any meaningful way in community with transgender people. So you're speaking from a place of ignorance. You're speaking without really any knowledge. You just believe that you know better about these things. But I'll give you some perspective if you have an open heart. So when I was younger and I was coming out as trans at school, I was indeed hiding it from my family. But do you know why that is? Because 40% of homeless youth are LGBT. And for me at the time, my biggest fear was that I would come out to my family and they would kick me out. I didn't want to be homeless. I didn't know how to survive on the streets. So you know what I did? I hid from my family that I was transgender until I was in a position where I could support myself. That decision was survival for me. I was raised in a very Christian, very conservative home, and I knew that if I told my father who I was, I would be removed from the home. And I'm very happy that I did things that way. And I'm so thankful that I had teachers who were supportive, especially my English teachers, because they were really cool. Side note, I'm in the process of burying my mother right now, and she kept every last one of my writing assignments, and I discovered that my first chosen name was Raven. I had completely forgotten about this, but oh my gosh, what an embarrassing stereotype. But anyway, I did what I needed to do to survive at the time, and part of that meant that I didn't communicate that I was trans to my parents, and I'm very thankful that I did things that way because it meant that I was able to survive. And that's a perspective that you would assume TYT would at least be kind of familiar with as people who are progressive, right? But it's clear to me that Cenk and Ana aren't doing the things that allies are supposed to do, listening to the people that are actually intimately impacted by the things they're talking about. They quite genuinely see the few times they've stood in solidarity with transgender people to be sufficient enough. In fact, we should be thankful that they're even doing it. And sure, like I said, maybe for them, it is very radical for them to stand in support of transgender people in any way. But when so-called allies refuse to hear that the scraps they throw us aren't actually sustaining anything other than their feel-good egos, it becomes incredibly clear that their allyship has no teeth at all.
But then everything escalated when they decided to talk about trans people in sports, which is a very common thing that a lot of cisgender people like to complain about because they don't understand how hormones work. They come in with all of these assumptions about biological males and think that there's some sort of magic secret advantage that just exists persistently regardless as to what hormones are literally dictating what your body is doing at the time. And that's where I came in, and I started tweeting at some of the hosts saying that, hey, you're wrong about this, that, or the other thing. You're missing these details. Hey, you're literally just being transphobic right now. I even reached out to people within the network to say like, hey, I would like to maybe sit down with Cenk and maybe even have an on-the-air conversation where I could talk about how all of this stuff actually works. I may not be a doctor, but I like to think that in my master's degree in biotechnology and my experience literally being a trans person, I might know a thing or two about all of these things. And I figured, hey, if Cenk doesn't know about this, maybe it'd be interesting for him to learn. But with that though, he wasn't really interested in having an on-the-air conversation because he seemed pretty intent on not changing his mind, but he was open to having a phone conversation. So we had a chat over the phone. I'm just going to give you a brief synopsis because that's really all that's important. The first sticking point was Cenk seemed convinced of this idea that I'm living in some sort of bubble. They've even said it on the air, that people fighting for trans rights are all living in some sort of bubble. I told Cenk very specifically, you know I have friends that are like big Joe Biden fans, right? Like they're theoretically to your political right. His reaction to that was quite literally laughter, which I just thought was like so hilarious. And he just kind of wouldn't believe. He was like, no, you're in a bubble. But really that kind of gave me the vibe of like, oh, Cenk really thinks that like every trans person is part of some sort of ideology, that we're of like a strict like political viewpoint, and that we don't just exist as like a type of person that exists. Which, I don't know if you know this, but that's actually something that the most unhinged transphobes are like spewing as conspiracy theories and stuff like that, is literally what like these unhinged right-wingers are saying. But it does kind of seem like Cenk is just in that camp of, oh, if you're trans, you must by definition be like some sort of radical leftist. Clearly not connecting the dots about people like Caitlyn Jenner or Blair White existing.
That was Benny Carollo, a transgender woman who left the TYT after Cenk and Ana started turning in a more reactionary transphobic direction. As she states, she tried very hard to get through to Cenk and Ana, but she was stonewalled at every turn. And this is partially what I mean when I say that they prefer perpetual subjugation, because it couldn't be that a transgender woman who lives this life and has been on hormones and understands how they function could possibly have anything of value to say as they debate whether or not transgender people are impacted by hormones. They know what's true because they're not transgender. And that perspective is one of supremacy. It's a very clear expression that a transgender person could never confidently and clearly state their own experiences. Those experiences must instead be defined and clarified by a person who's not transgender. And this opinion is weighed so much more. And that is, once again, supremacy. Without much knowledge at all, they have all the answers, know everything to be said about the topic, and we should be thankful to them for advocating for us in any way, shape, or form. Thankful enough to step aside, put our issues down, and help them elect a Democratic politician. They ask for perpetual servitude to the cause while offering very little in the way of support. And you know, the cherry on top of all of this is Ana let her mask slip just a little bit when she would go on TYT and address Benny in a video.
So unfortunately, Benny has decided to leave TYT. I am definitely heartbroken over her decision to do that.
So let's just be clear. Benny left because of their transphobia, and when Ana went on air to address the topic, she misgenders her. Like, if I wrote this down in a script, this would be a little too on the nose. Now, the main topic they're discussing here is transgender people in sports. And if you follow my channel, you know that I have not made a video about this topic. And that's for a reason. Mostly because I feel like I'm still collecting my information. I tend to try to speak from my own experiences and perspective, and I can only really say what I've gone through, right? All I know is that when I was younger and my dad would ask me to help do some heavy lifting around the house, I was, with very little athletic training, able to help him. And once I started taking hormones, it was like all of that went away, right? Hormones pretty severely impacted my strength and ability, not to mention they made me gain a lot of weight. To some degree, I can understand why this particular topic is such a hot button issue for people. We live in a society where sports are gendered, and the subtle suggestion, even though this is not true in all cases, in fact, some sports are only gendered because women were kicking the men's asses, but the subtext of why we have a men's league and a women's league is because men are supposedly stronger than women. Right? And that is our common understanding. And transgender people are a minority, right? So a lot of people, when they hear this conversation, all they hear is this person who used to be a man is trying to play with girls, and that's unfair. I understand why that is a point of discourse, right? But here's the issue I have with this discourse. The United States population is about 332 million people, and transgender athletes make up, get this, 150 people within that population, meaning that there's not thousands of transgender athletes trying to infiltrate sports. There's not even hundreds of them. It is quite literally a minority within a minority, which means that this hot button topic being presented as a primary concern is completely disproportionate to reality. I personally know a lot of transgender people, and I don't know a single transgender athlete, though I know they exist, and I'm inclined to say that they should be allowed to play school sports. And what I really don't love about this discourse is the suggestion that if a transgender person competed in sports and was successful, that would always be because they had some sort of unfair advantage. It could never be that, like their cis counterparts, they trained hard and they were successful. It's always going to be because they have some sort of unfair advantage. It places transgender people in a position where they can't be successful, where once again, people are only comfortable with them as long as they are perpetually living in subjugation to people who are not transgender, as long as they exist as a sort of permanent lower class. And look, I'm not stupid. We don't tend to measure somebody's access to civil rights based on their participation in athletics, but that's exactly how this conversation often functions. If trans women and girls have an unfair advantage, it's because they're really men, which means they shouldn't be able to participate in women's sports, which of course means they shouldn't be able to gain access to women's spaces, which of course means that they can't use the women's restroom, which of course means that they can't be in public for more than 3 hours, which of course means that they probably shouldn't medically transition so that they would even have to be in that position. In some states, adults are increasingly having their access to gender-affirming care challenged, and in some places, their right to gain access to gender-affirming care has indeed been removed. To answer my own question, no, I don't think that trans people and those who support them are trans rights activists. Frankly, I don't describe myself in those terms, but we are indeed at a point in the timeline where asking for access to life-saving gender-affirming care is pushy and radical. So in effect, we have to be activists in order to fight for our own survival. And the ideology that Cenk seems to hate so much is the very idea that we deserve the right to exist, thrive, and survive. It is a condemnation of our country that the things that everyone wants is activism for a very specific group of people. At the end of the day, I think Cenk and Ana are trying to hide their actual transphobia behind electoral politics. We see already that this is not the biggest concern for Republicans. So it says quite a bit, actually, that they're choosing to die on this particular hill. I think it's more of an indictment of their actual feelings, their actual transphobia, than it is anything else. The polls do not reflect that throwing transgender people to the wayside is actually going to substantially help them. So what is this really about? Cenk and Ana seem convinced that this is about demanding purity. But in truth, it's about their audacity to rub shoulders with bigots while describing the fight for trans survival as selfish and clout hungry. It's distasteful and quite pathetic. But like I said, I stopped watching TYT a very long time ago. And you probably should too. Anyway, I think that's all I had to say about this topic. I'm very curious to know what you guys have to say. Be sure to leave me a comment in the comment box below. I'm looking forward to reading them. And on that note, I will talk to you guys later. I want you to always remember and to never forget that you are beautiful and you are loved. Unless you're Cenk and Ana. Bye.